On January the 27th, 1945, the group of concentration and extermination camps in Poland, known as Auschwitz-Birkenau, was liberated by the Soviet Red Army. Tomorrow, Holocaust Memorial Day, marks the day of liberation 80 years ago. The Red Army were on the Vistula-Oder offensive, and hearing their guns, the camp guards had begun a forced death march of some 60,000 inmates west. So there were only 7,000 people left in the 40 camps which made up the complex when the Red Army arrived, the camp guards having fled as the Russians advanced. The unimaginable horror which unfolded before the Red Army's eyes is well documented, as are the stories of the survivors. It led one of them, the famous Italian Jewish writer, to write, "There is Auschwitz, and so there is no God." Justice for some was to come at the Nuremberg trials. At Nuremberg, difficult questions as to what is and what is not acceptable in war began to be hammered out at an international level, going far beyond the 1929 Geneva Convention on the treatment of those captured in conflict. The original convention was expanded to include non-combatant civilians and introduced the concept, amongst others, of crimes against peace and crimes against humanity, concepts flouted continually in subsequent wars. But a baseline was established against which perpetrators of war crimes could be measured, nowadays at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. As a species, we are incredibly good at organization, if the mood takes us. The ruthless killing machine contained within Auschwitz was a model of organization. Over 1.1 million people died in just this one camp, including the wife and young son of a devout Polish Roman Catholic doctor who arrived in the UK as a refugee after the war, and whom I knew well when I was a young woman. He never got over the horror of his loss. Dictatorships usually end badly. In Germany, the infernal vision of one man and his wildly inflated ego and half-baked theories on race was able to captivate an entire nation. But how? There was clever propaganda, of course, but that would not have been enough to turn an entire nation, apart from the brave few who resisted, into compliant Nazis. Ordinary people, doctors, nurses, secretaries, farmers, academics, factory workers, and indeed the army, how were they manipulated into serving this efficient and murderous regime? The full answer to those questions is for the historians. But fear and intimidation had a lot to do with it. And for me, it was most certainly what nowadays we call the vision thing, which Hitler had in spades. As we know, the political sands worldwide are shifting beneath our feet, and the liberal values exemplified, for example, in the revamped Geneva Convention are not as secure as we once thought. Whose vision are we to follow? What is our vision for a healthy society? The theme of society building runs throughout both the Hebrew and Christian Bibles. As Moses led the tribes of Israel out of Egypt to wander through the desert on their way to the Promised Land, he faced the enormous task of holding together a disparate people. Under his leadership, they had to forge a new rule-based order of society under God. This period produced the Ten Commandments and the Torah, the law under which all Jews were to live, laws later challenged in part by Jesus. These were, if you like, God's vision thing for these early wanderers. This theme is picked up in our reading from Nehemiah. Nehemiah was one of the many Jews carried into exile in Babylon, and as a cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes, unexpectedly got permission to return to Jerusalem, now in ruins, to rebuild the city walls, which he did. But it was the rebuilding of the community of God's people which was far more challenging. The rag-bag of returning exiles from Babylon in the 5th century BC had all but lost their sense of what it meant to be a practicing Jew. They had to learn again about their God and to learn to live together as a society obedient to God. This was both practical and theological. So in the scene so vividly described in our reading, while Ezra read the scriptures, the ears of the people were attentive to the law. They were not being asked to follow a blueprint of a perfect society, but to live together humbly in community under God and to obey his laws as laid out in their scriptures. Some 2,500 years later, a young rabbi in a small synagogue in an unremarkable town called Nazareth astounded his hearers. On being asked to read from the scroll of Isaiah, he read the passage we heard earlier. On finishing his reading, we are told in that delicious detail that he handed the scroll to the attendant and sat down and began to teach. What he taught both bewildered and horrified his hearers, a detail of the story that follows on from what we heard this morning. He declared in their hearing that he was the anointed one, or Messiah, that Isaiah had foretold would come. It was an astonishing claim. But for us today, in this place, it is the mast to which he nailed his colours that should concern us. His vision thing, if you like, is straightforward. He has come to bring good news to the poor, to release captives, to heal the sick, to end oppression, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. In other words, he does not have a blueprint or carefully organised plan of how society should be. Rather, he comes to build a community based on justice and love, focused on particular on the poor. No diagrams, no spreadsheets, no half-baked racial theories. Not a society based on resentment, grievance, or hatred, but one which reveals the long-awaited Messiah, who as God's Son signifies God with us now and for eternity. Nehemiah guided the people of Israel to live under the law. Jesus invited them to believe in him and follow another, more radical path. As memories of the Second World War fade, and younger generations sometimes have only the haziest knowledge of what happened then, we must not let this terrible period of history be forgotten. Which is why Holocaust Memorial Day is so important. We must remember collectively what human beings are capable of at their very worst, so that the poisonous vision of a society run along genocidal lines and unimaginable cruelty may never happen again. As Christians, we must protect our democracies and remember under whose divine light and promise we flourish. Or as one of my favourite blessings exhorts us to do. Go forth into the world in peace. Be of good courage. Hold fast to that which is good. Render to no one evil for evil. Support the weak. Help the afflicted. Show love to everyone. Love and serve the Lord, rejoicing in the power of the Holy Spirit. If we hold to this as our vision thing, we shall have made a very